In our modern world today, there are so many billionaires out there that it seems like getting to be one is unto all that difficult. But in reality, becoming a billionaire is no easy feat. It takes hundreds of years for most of them to build their fortunes, and even longer if they want to have their name written in history books. Most people who become billionaires do so by starting companies or investing their money. Yet despite the fact that these methods seem so common and almost normal now, there was one thing that preceded them that made them possible, and that is crime. Most of the biggest fortunes in the world were built on crime, and the Mafia is the perfect example of this. They grew from literally nothing to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. So here's how the Mafia built their empire from nothing. Starting a business nowadays is all about knowing the right people and having the right connections. In the case of the Mafia, however, things were a bit different as they actually got their start in a place where knowing the right people was literally a matter of life and death. The beginning of the Mafia can be traced back to 1860 in Sicily. This was around the time when the Italian state had just been unified, and the ruling class of Sicily was the old feudal landowners. These aristocrats had ruled over the island for centuries, but with the unification of Italy, they had lost much of their power. What didn't change, however, was their mindset. They still wanted to rule over Sicily like they always had, only now they had to do it under the Italian government. To achieve this goal, they formed secret societies called the Mafia. These groups consisted of both aristocrats and commoners who wanted to take down anyone who went against their interests. If you were ever to cross the Mafia, then your business would mysteriously burn to the ground, and your animals would mysteriously die. And if you were an aristocrat like the ones who started the organization, then your head would mysteriously get chopped off. Needless to say, the Italian government wasn't too happy about these secret societies, and so they did their best to crack them down. Unfortunately, however, the police force in Italy at the time was not very advanced, which allowed the Mafia to flourish. The members of the Mafia were able to escape any punishment by simply bribing the local police officers, judges, or even politicians. And so the Italian government was completely helpless against them. They could do anything they wanted and get away with it. Scot-free. This was the situation that the Mafia would stay in for quite some time, until eventually something happened that would allow them to grow into a global organization. Now, you might think that what led to the rise of the Mafia was World War II, but that's actually not true. Even though the Mafia did play a big role in the war, they were already a powerful organization long before it began. No, the event that allowed them to spread around the globe was Prohibition in the United States. You see, during the 1920s, the United States decided to ban the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of alcohol. This was supposed to decrease the amount of crime and violence in the U.S., but instead, it simply created an opportunity for criminals to make tons of money. The Mafia was quick to capitalize on this, and they sent agents to the U.S. to figure out how they could make the most money off of this new law. Of course, there was only one answer: selling illegal alcohol. Back in Sicily, the Mafia had mostly worked as extortionists and murderers. However, they knew that if they wanted to expand to America, they would need more than just those skills. That's why they began training their men in accounting and business practices. This way they would know how to run a proper business when the time came. By the end of the 1920s, the Mafia had set up shop in New York City, and they began selling alcohol through a series of bars and restaurants. These businesses were mostly fronts for their real operation, which was a massive alcohol distillery in the countryside. With this move, the Mafia had officially entered the organized crime scene in America, and this would be the beginning of their rise to power. The Mafia had several advantages over the other gangs in America. First, they already had experience running criminal organizations. Second, they had a lot of money thanks to the extortion and protection rackets back in Italy. And third, they were disciplined. The members of the Mafia were not like your typical street gang. They knew how important it was to keep things professional, and they never put their personal feelings before the business. All of these advantages allowed the Mafia to quickly become one of the most powerful gangs in America. During the Great Depression, while everyone else was going broke, the Mafia was making millions. Not only did they have control of the alcohol market, but they also controlled the gambling and prostitution markets. By the late 1930s, the Mafia had become so powerful that other gangs began joining them. Soon enough, the American underworld was entirely controlled by the Mafia. They had complete control of organized crime in the country. Unfortunately for the Mafia, this reign wouldn't last forever. During World War II, the government decided to finally crack down on them. The leaders of the Mafia were arrested and sent to jail, while their businesses were seized by the government. Once again, the Mafia was on the brink of collapse. But just like before, they managed to survive. After the war ended, the Mafia simply carried on as before. They bribed the cops, intimidated witnesses, and killed anyone who got in their way. Within a few years, they were back to where they once were. However, this time was a bit different. Now that they had survived 2 major crackdowns, the Mafia knew that they needed to change, or else they would eventually get wiped out. That's why after the war, the Mafia became a lot more professional. They began keeping detailed records of their finances, and they implemented accounting rules. They also established clear lines of authority, and they began holding regular meetings to discuss their operations. To this day, the Mafia is still one of the most secretive organizations in the world. But these measures are likely what allowed them to survive for so long. In the meantime, the world was changing at a rapid pace. Technology was advancing at unprecedented levels, and people's lifestyles were changing. However, the Mafia was slow to adapt. For example, they stuck with old-school methods of communication, and they were reluctant to use new technologies. They also failed to adapt to the changing tastes of the customers. In the old days, people were happy with basic goods and services, but nowadays, they expect much more. The Mafia couldn't keep up with this demand, which caused their business to begin shrinking. This was especially true in the US, where the government had launched a full-scale war on the Mafia. By the late 1990s, the Mafia was a shadow of its former self. Their businesses were failing, and their ranks had been decimated. But even though the Mafia may not be as powerful as it once was, it's still a formidable organization. They're still involved in a wide range of criminal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and murder. Plus, they've gone global. They have a presence in every country in the world, which allows them to operate no matter where the government cracked down. Nowadays, the Mafia is more of a consulting business than anything else. They help other criminals get started in the business, and they offer advice on how to succeed in the field. Basically, the Mafia is like the Illuminati of the criminal world. Sure, they're not as powerful as they once were, but they're still a formidable force that should not be messed with. Now, the Mafia may not be as glamorous as it seems. In fact, it's really quite dangerous. You're risking your life every day when you're out there hustling. But if you're willing to take the risk, then there's no better business out there. Just ask any of the members of the Mafia, and they all tell you that this is the best business in the world. Sure, it's dangerous, but the rewards are just too great to pass up. If you learned something new, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more.